Okay, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker of PyCon UK 2018. It's Alex Chan, who he's a software developer at the Wellcome Collection. He's also a member of our organizing team, and has been a tireless part of that machine. He's very interested in a number of issues that concern us as software professionals who are responsible for building systems that make the world safer for the people who use them, and also for the world itself beyond those users who are affected by those systems. So his talk is building trust in a world of suspicious minds, and in this talk he's going to cover some of those questions for you. So please give a very warm welcome to Alex Chan.
Thank you for that introduction. And as Daniele said, my name's Alex. I'm a software developer at the Wellcome Trust in London, organizer of this conference, and it's a pleasure to be opening this year's conference, and I really hope you all have a great time. So the reason I was asked to do this talk, I spend my time thinking about a lot of ways that systems can be exploited for harassment, for abuse, and to do nasty things, which is a really polite way of saying I'm really good at breaking stuff. So the fact that we've made the projector work on the first try is a huge achievement. So if nothing else goes well this morning, I'll take that today. But when you start by thinking about how things can be exploited and broken, you often come to it with a very defensive mindset. Okay, you're thinking about damage control. How do I limit the potential of harm? And Daniele challenged me to flip that on its head. Could you go the other way and not just design a system that prevents bad behavior, but actually encourages good behavior? And I started thinking about good behavior and how you build that and how you encourage that. And what I really started thinking about was trust. Because trust is really important, isn't it? It underpins all effective working relationships, whether that's with other people, whether it's with our tools, whether it's with our users, the people we're building systems for. If we feel like we trust somebody, we feel like we can rely on them. We can cooperate them. We can believe that they will actually do what they say they will. And it gives us a sense of security. It means we're not looking over our shoulder for the next mistake, for the next betrayal, trying to work out what's going to go wrong. So we're going to talk about trust today because I think trust is a foundation of all good working relationships and the other positive behaviors that they foster. But trust is often a kind of a nebulous thing, isn't it? We sort of know when we trust somebody, we know when we don't. But I think it's helpful to start by having a definition of trust. So Charles Feltman has written a book called The Thin Book of Trust that has a definition I really like. Trust is choosing to make something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. So let's break down that definition a little. First of all, trust is choosing to risk. It's a risk assessment. We look at our past experiences with somebody or with something, and we decide if we want to take the risk. And if we trust somebody, we probably do want to take that risk, and if we don't trust them, then we don't. Then it's taking something you value, and we value all sorts of things. Money, happiness, fulfillment, not being fired from our jobs, not being booed off a stage in front of 400 people. There are lots of things we value, and trust is taking one of the things, and we're staking that thing that we value. And finally, we're making it vulnerable. We're giving up some control over the thing we care about. And I think in the software industry, we often think about vulnerability as a really bad thing, because we think about it in the context of security vulnerabilities. It's a bug, it's a hack, it's got to be patched and closed off immediately. And that's right, but vulnerability is also really important. Because if you have vulnerability, you have the opportunity for progress, the opportunity for growth. And we don't see this any more than in our romantic relationships. You need vulnerability to be able to grow, and vulnerability is a really important part of trust as well. So that, I think, is the working definition of trust that we're going to use today. And so with trust, we're usually pretty good at articulating when we don't trust somebody. So hands up in the audience, who has ever thought, I just don't trust them? Think you've just not trusted somebody. I think that's pretty much almost the entire audience. And if I asked you all had a good reason, right? Maybe there was a lie, there was an incident, they were mean, you heard some gossip. But what if I asked you to go in the other direction? Think of somebody you really trust. Think of somebody you would absolutely trust, And why do you trust them? That feels like a harder question, doesn't it? We're often aware that we trust somebody, but it can be hard to pinpoint the moment when that happened. How do we go from the state of somebody we just know to somebody we actually trust? Because trust, it's not something you can tell somebody to do. You can't ask for it. And as much as Facebook's marketing team would love, you can't buy it. And that's not great, is it? Because if trust is such an important thing, we shouldn't just be passive participants. So that's what I want to look at today. I want to look at how do we actually take an active role in the formation of trust? How do we actively build trust for ourselves? So what's the state of trust? In 2018, a year of only happiness and rainbows, how much do we trust each other? Because if we go on Twitter, in the 6 minutes that I've been speaking, there have probably been about 6 years' worth of news. It feels like the world is on fire, sometimes literally. And the unfortunate thing is that this means that it seems like there often isn't any trust. Studies consistently show that trust in each other, trust in individuals is declining, and trust in big institutions, businesses, governments, non-profits, the media. We're not trusting those institutions as much as well. And those are places that we might have once looked to for trust and guidance. So you wouldn't inspect all of the credentials of all the journalists on a newspaper, but you trust that the newspaper would do that for you, and the newspaper would do some fact-checking, and we no longer trust that they will do that. So how did we get here? I think it was caused by 3 major trends in the last 10, 15 years. First of all are some major world events. Second is the downsides of globalization. And third is everyone's favorite topic, social media. So let's go through this a little. First of all, some significant events. If you look at the last 20 years, I think there have been several major turning points where we stopped trusting people. The first was the September 11th attacks in 2001 and the subsequent response to that by the governments of the world. Then the war in Iraq, the faulty rationale for that, 45 minutes to deployment of weapons of mass destruction, the 2008 financial collapse, which we're still seeing the fallout of 10 years later. And I think in this country, and I'm very envious of our attendees who have come overseas for this, the Brexit referendum and all of the subsequent negotiations that have happened. And all of these things, these events, they leave people feeling angry, feeling bitter, feeling divided, suspicious, skeptical, and those are a really poor recipe for trust. When we have all those heated emotions, it's not surprising perhaps that we don't trust some of these big institutions as much. And one thing that's interesting as well is I think we might be in the middle of another one. Because for the last few years there have been a trickle of stories about bad things happening at tech companies, probably companies that some of us work at. Privacy violations at Facebook, location tracking at Google, safety violations at Uber. And it feels to me like that trickle is starting to become a flood. Every week I look at the headlines and I see some other bad thing that's happening at another tech company. I do wonder if we'll look back in a couple of years and realize this is the point at which trust in tech started to falter. Maybe one day we could aspire to be as trusted as bankers. I'm serious. So those are some of the major world events that I think have already happened and that perhaps we need to be worrying about. So second, let's talk about the downsides of globalization. Because on the one hand, globalization is wonderful. It's made the world a smaller place. It's made it a more interconnected place. It's the reason we have such a diverse group of attendees here today. The laptop I'm giving this presentation on has its components assembled in I don't know how many countries, and yet was manufactured for me relatively cheaply. So I'm not saying globalization is a bad thing, but it's not without its downsides. And I think a lot of the time those benefits aren't evenly distributed. Too many people, I think too many workers, too many families feel like they're bearing all the brunt of globalization, and they're not feeling any of the benefits. And that could be in things like automation and job losses, which again, we're sort of kind of responsible for, but also things like open borders, mass movement of people, changing of cultures. And so people are afraid. They're worried about their economic security, their job prospects, and they lash out. And this manifests itself in things like nationalism and xenophobia. And those of you who are older in the audience might remember a time when those were considered fringe political movements. Happier days. Because with the advent of social media, I think it's taken a lot those fringe movements and it's made them mainstream. I think we're seeing now the true effect of having a fire hose of unfiltered information and outrage piped directly to a screen in our pockets. Social media, you go on Twitter, it stirs up anger. It provokes hate. It spreads lies. When I was younger, there was a quote my grandfather loved, lie can get halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. And not only has social media made that go a lot faster, it's also completely mangled that quote. Because if you go and punch that quote into Google, you will find at least 15 people who it is attributed to. And that cannot possibly be right. So social media is a problem. And as well as that, part of the problem is fake news. You know, that's become a sort of a bit of a catchphrase the last year or so. It's used as a catch-all term for everything that Donald Trump doesn't like, which seems to be everything. But there is legitimate fake news is an oxymoron. Let me try that again. There is news that is really fake. You can go on the internet now, you can find a website, it looks like a legitimate news source, it's got sentences that contain words that you think are facts, and it's entirely wrong. And this makes it, and it means it's much harder now to determine truth from false when we're reading the media, when we're reading the news. And not only that, I think social media has actually eroded our ability to do so by simply presenting us with a fire hose. It's almost a denial of service attack on our ability to make trust decisions because there's just so much stuff we have to deal with. So these are the three things I think that have led to an erosion of trust. Major world events, the downsides of globalization, the advent and spread of social media. And these three trends all build on each other, they accelerate each other, and so perhaps it's not so surprising that we don't trust each other as much as we used to. But it's not like trust is gone entirely. We can still be very trusting people. Let's look at a few examples. First of all, online banking. Now, the vast majority of you, if you paid for your ticket for the conference yourself, you will have seen a screen that looked a bit like this. And you all readily put in your credit card details and click the pay button. Well, I assume you did because you're all here and we gave you a ticket. You put in your credit card details and you trusted that we were going to send that to our credit card provider and use it to pay for your ticket. And we weren't going to use it to buy bitcoins. We weren't going to send it to a server in Russia. It wouldn't be sent to my personal Gmail. We just sort of trust that we can put our internet banking details into the internet and it's going to work. And that's a really recent thing if you think about it. And not so many years ago, that would have been seen like a very unusual thing to do. And yet today we just take it for granted. Another example, ride sharing, Uber. Now, when I was younger, I'm sure that's just a driver who's making sure she crosses the road safely. An upstanding, fine citizen. When I was younger, I was taught stranger danger. You don't give out your personal details on the internet. You don't get into other people's cars. You don't give out your location. And now it is routine for people to give out their personal details on the internet to a stranger to come to their location so that we can get in their car. And then we pay them for it. And many people, for some reason, many people trust us even more than they trust traditional black cabs or public transport. And again, this book isn't that old. This is a really weird inversion of trust. And the final one, Airbnb. How many of you are staying tonight not in a licensed hotel chain, not in a registered B&B, not in Mrs. Potts, but you've gone to a stranger's home? You've picked a random stranger on the internet and said, yes, I will stay in your home, and I trust that you will not steal my things or turn out to be a bloodthirsty axe murderer or kidnap me so that I'm never seen again. I am actually seeing a few hands in the audience. Okay. I'm thankful. I actually wasn't intending that to be an audience participation thing, but sure, thank you. And likewise, your hosts, they have invited you, a suspicious programmer type who's going to PyCon, and they've just trusted that you're going to come into their home and sleep there, and you're not going to steal their things, you won't ransack their home, and that it's perfectly safe to invite almost literally a revolving door of strangers into their home. Again, something that we would have thought was quite odd a few years ago. And the thing is, this isn't an accident. Okay? Just because you don't trust politicians very much, or less than you used to at least, doesn't mean that you now randomly trust strangers on the internet. The reason we trust these things is because people took explicit steps to make that happen. Now, whether that's the green padlock icon, although be honest, how many of you actually bothered to look for that? Or it's rating systems with Uber or Airbnb verification, all of these things, somebody did explicit work to make it a system you could trust. And that's so we can do the same. Trust clearly isn't impossible. There's still a lot of trust in those things, but also in the way society functions. And so we can actively set out to build trust. So let's talk about that now. Let's talk about how we actually, if we want to be as trusted as Uber or online banking or something like that, how do you build trust? Now, one exercise that is often used to build trust is this one. Some of you might be familiar with it if you've been on a team building day. The way it works is that it's called trust falls, and one partner closes their eyes and they fall backwards. And the other person they know is going to catch them, and therefore they know that they trust the person behind them. And as long as you do and the exercise, obviously, you are supposed to catch them. I did this for a closed group at work on Monday just to run through it. And 2 people said not only had they done this exercise, but their partner had dropped them. So, clearly a very effective exercise. No. Trust is not built in one-shot interactions. It's also not built knowing exactly what's going to happen and knowing that they'll catch you, because if not, they'll be in trouble for breaking the exercise. Trust is built incrementally. It's built over a series of interactions, small steps. And remember I said earlier that trust is a risk assessment? When you do a risk assessment, you're looking at your past interactions. And we make a decision as to, as we interact with people, we get a sense of whether we can trust them. And that all feeds into the risk assessment. And it's important to note as well, we can use that both, those interactions are both with the individual person involved, so maybe, and groups as a whole. So for example, I've been coming to PyCon UK for many years. Everybody I've met has always been lovely, charming, and nice. So if I come out and meet some of you first-timers later, I trust that I'll probably have the same experience. I'm judging the group, I've had interactions with the group, and that causes me to trust it. Now, on the other hand, if I said I had a printer in the other room, and the printer just works, how many of you trust me? It doesn't. So, trust is built incrementally. We have a series of interactions, and as we see trustworthy behavior in a group, in a person, in a system, that's how we know that we'll be able to trust it in the future. So to understand how we build it, let's think about how trust works. Now, some of you might be familiar with the fire triangle: fuel, heat, and oxygen. You need all 3 to make a fire, although please don't try that at home. And if you take one of those things away, you put the fire out. And I think trust is very similar. There are 3 components that you need, and you need all 3 of them for trust. And those components are honesty, reliability, and shared values. So let's break those down a little. Start with honesty. Honesty for me encompasses things like truthfulness. Do you always say things that are true, or at least that you believe to be true? Because if you lie to me, how can I be sure I won't believe you next time? I won't believe that you're telling me the truth. It's about sincerity, believing that we care about something and that we believe what we're saying. And how many of us have read a blog post from a startup or from Google, the Google Reader team even, saying, we're delighted to say that we've been acquired and therefore the product you all love is going away. And we're really excited for that as well, to screw you all over. So sincerity is important as well. And finally, transparency. It's really important to say bad things as well as good things. And that doesn't necessarily mean being mean, but it does mean giving an honest, what we would call an honest opinion. Imagine, for example, you've got a friend who always tells you that you look lovely no matter what you're wearing, and then you're trying on an outfit, maybe because you're about to go on stage for a big presentation, and you ask them, hey, do I look okay today? And they say, yeah, you look great. Yeah, but you would say that. So it's important to be transparent. It's important to say the bad things as well as the good things. So that's what honesty is. Then we've got reliability. So reliability is about keeping your promises. If you promise you'll do something, you actually stick to that. You don't break a promise. You don't promise more than you can deliver. And it's about consistency. And I think perhaps in this room we might appreciate that no more than in, for example, a test suite. I'm sure many of us have had to debug a flaky test, a test that sometimes passes and then it fails, but you rerun the test and it passes this time, so it's all okay. And that's almost less useful than a test that's just broken, because then you don't know if you could believe it when it passes again next time. And it's sort of similar to the transparency thing. You want it to be consistent. And finally, shared values. And this is about things like having common goals. So you're a team that is all going, if you're a team, you're all going in the same direction, you're all aiming for the same thing, you're not heading off in different directions. About having common values and beliefs, you all believe the same thing. And I think as well a common understanding. Raise your hand if you've been into a meeting where everybody agreed what they were going to do, and everybody agreed had a different idea in their head. Quite a few of us. So it's about that as well. It's about us all being on the same page. So those are the things you need for trust, I believe: honesty, reliability, and shared values. And I think it's important to note that you couldn't take one of these in isolation. Take honesty, for example. I'm sure we would all agree that honesty is a very positive trait. We would all like to be considered honest people. We would all like to work with honest people. But just because somebody is honest doesn't necessarily mean that you trust them. Imagine somebody who is honest and unreliable. Then we believe that they'll tell the truth, but we might not believe them to keep their commitments. And the classic example of this is if you had a surgeon who was honest but incompetent, would you trust them to do a major operation on you? And I really hope for your sake that the answer is no. So that's what we need. That's what the ingredients for trust are: honesty, reliability, and shared values. And if you encourage those things, if you promote those things, then you have an environment where trust can start to build. But how do you actually do that? Because it's all very well to say, hey, I want to be a more trustworthy person, so I'm just going to try harder. And that's a recipe to get very little done. We see this, I think, when we're building software. If I want to write less buggy software, it's not just a case of I'm going to try harder and magically write better software. I might make a small gain, and that's not nothing, but if I want a step change, we look to external processes, things like tests and code review and documentation. When we want to write better software, we put in place new tools, new processes that will change the way we work, that enable us to write better software, and trust is exactly the same. So let's think about some ways we can do that. First of all, though, something we can do with trust that always helps is being a role model, being something that other people can follow. Humans are naturally mimics. Okay? We will imitate the behavior of the people around us. We see this all the time. An example of this is if you're at a company that is where one person fudges the financial numbers. Not that we could all imagine a company like that, and obviously I want to stress that this company is entirely hypothetical and fictional. Somebody fudges the financial numbers, and then management don't do anything about it. They just say, oh yeah, that's fine, we'll send that out the door. Then other people learn, other people start to copy them. And eventually it becomes the company culture that, hey, it's fine to cook the books, it's fine to break the financial numbers, to the point we copy each other. So by being a role model, by showing the behaviors that you want to promote in the world, by being honest, by being reliable, by having those shared values and seeking those out, that is a way to build trust. Another thing you can do that I think is really important at a high level is having monitoring, have check-ins. Now, trust is not a metric. We can't get a KPI or put it on a dashboard, but it is a thing we sort of have some spidey sense of. When I asked you earlier to think of somebody you didn't trust and then somebody you did trust, I think pretty much everyone got it almost immediately. Because we do have a sense of how much we trust somebody, and is our trust declining or is it increasing? And you can ask somebody, right, do you trust me? And it can seem awkward at first, right, saying to somebody, hey, do you trust me? Do I trust, and asking yourself, do you trust them? But I've started doing this a lot in my personal relationships in the last year or so. Actually, if I'm out with a friend and we've been seeing each other for a while, hey, are we good? Is everything okay? Am I being overbearing? Is it too much? That sort of thing. Actually being aware of it, actively tracking it, can be a way to start seeing, are you doing what you need? And if not, do you need to change? But without having the monitoring, without having those check-ins, it's hard to know that you need to be making a change. So what does that change look like? Let's start with some examples of honesty. So I talked about Airbnb earlier, that your hosts invite strangers into their home. And one of the things you probably say to them on the form if you were given a tick box is, I am not an axe murderer. I do not steal other people's things. And that's fine, but anybody can check a checkbox on the internet. So one of the things they do to do identity verification, to do verification of this stuff, to do verification of your honesty, is they ask you for some ID. You upload your government ID, they run that against various databases to say, are you wanted by the FBI, Interpol, are you a known terrorist? Because if not, maybe people don't want you in their home. So by actually that's an example of a system that actively verifies honesty, that doesn't just trust doesn't just trust on blind faith that people are going to do what they say they will. Another thing you can think about is incentivizing transparency. I'm sure a lot of us have managers who tell us that they would love us to be transparent and tell them when they're doing something wrong and tell them about their mistakes, and that's a really nice thing to hear. But often it's difficult to put that into practice. Because if you want to make a complaint about maybe someone at work, and that person is the person who also controls your salary and benefits and and career prospects, maybe you're going to feel uncomfortable telling them, hey, actually you did this thing that screwed up, because you're worried about the retribution for you. So it's all very well saying we want transparency, we have to actually think about how we're going to do it. And one way to do that is change the carrot and the stick. So this is an example. I said earlier that I break things. This is an example of the API at work just before I left for the conference. I'd done a production deploy about 10 minutes before getting on a train, which is always the best time to do a production deploy. And you'll see this is not supposed to appear. I'd made a bug in what I deployed. And what I could have done would be to run out the door and say, I didn't know, I didn't touch it, it must have just broken. And I think pretty quickly somebody would have figured out, they'd have looked at the logs and said, Alex, there's a production deploy from here, and then 30 seconds later it went down. We think those things are connected. My coworkers are smart. But instead, and I could have done that, if I'd done that, I would have got in trouble. But instead, I fessed up, I said, I sort of broke this thing accidentally, let's roll it back. And then that was an opportunity for us to have a discussion about, well, why did this happen, why did it break, how do we stop Alex screwing up next time? Because let's be honest, it's mostly me. And that was a benefit to me, right? And it was a benefit for both the team to make our API more resilient, and it's a benefit for me because I feel like my coworkers trust me, and that I know I'm not going to make the same mistake again. So there's a benefit to me being transparent, and there's a penalty for me not being transparent, which is often the inverse of what the default system would be, right? If we weren't thinking about it, I'd say I've broken the API and said, Alex, and they'd say, Alex, you idiot, fix it again. So by changing the incentives of transparency, by making that, you need to think about that if you want to promote transparency. So there's some examples of honesty. Let's talk next about reliability. So going back to one of the examples from earlier, you perhaps wouldn't trust riding in a stranger's car, but if you had lots of people who told you, no, this person is really good at letting strangers ride in their car, you might be more inclined to do so. And that's what rating systems do. And we're almost drowning in rating systems these days, so this is an example. This is a screenshot from Uber. I came over this morning, but also Amazon, TripAdvisor, Yelp, Google Maps. There are lots of ways that we crowdsource ratings, and that's a measure of reliability. We can decide, well, other people trusted this person and that was okay, before we decide to commit ourselves. But how do we actually, if we are the person who's being rated, how do we drive up that reliability? How do we ratchet it up? So this is great if you're already reliable. How do you get there? And I think actually this is something we as software developers are pretty good at, because we are used to working with unreliable systems. They're called computers. And we've built, all these different ways to improve the reliability of our software, to improve the reliability of the computers we build. Things like testing and code review and documentation. You all write documentation, right? And other such things. We've got a huge number of systems for improving the quality of the code we write. Something you will notice about these, though, is that none of these come from me. These are all external systems, right? There's a Travis server that runs and checks my code passes test before I check it in. We require pull requests through the GitHub user interface. The Scala compiler will not let me write something that doesn't fit the type system, which is why Python is inherently a better language, but don't tell them I said that. We have all these external tools. We have all these external systems that help us improve our reliability. And we can do the same for the promises we make outside the text editor. So on a personal level, that might be something as simple as keeping a diary or keeping a task list so you can see what promises you're making so you don't forget something, or you don't overpromise and underdeliver. You don't promise you can do something and not realize that you've already promised to do 3 things this week. Another thing I think we can look to if we're looking at a larger group is things like agile. And I know to some people that's a bit of a dirty word, but you don't necessarily need to go all in on agile to get some of the benefits from it. Things like stand-up meetings, retrospectives, planning meetings, just so you all know what you're doing, and you all know if you've promised to do something for somebody else, if something is slipping, if a promise isn't going to be delivered. Again, being really explicit about the tracking, keeping on top of meetings like that. I think there's a lot of value in some of the practices from Agile in maintaining reliability in teams. And finally, let's think about some shared values. Because I think shared values we most often notice when they diverge. Because shared values are often implicit. We believe that the people around us are inherently reasonable people. They hold the same well-rounded, correct views as we do. And then one day we discover that actually one of the people we work for really isn't as nice as that. Maybe they hold a view we object to. Maybe they didn't understand something. Maybe they had different belief. And so the way to get this out is to stop being implicit about our shared values and actually be explicit about them. One of my favorite lines from the Zone of Python, which is a statement of explicit shared values for Python programmers, explicit is better than implicit. If we talk about our values and we talk about the things we care about, that can be really valuable, and that's how you close those disagreements. I asked earlier if any of you had been in meetings where everyone agreed to do something and they had different agreements, and one way we often do that is have meeting minutes. Have a list of agreed actions that is sent out to everyone that they can then look at and say, hey, I didn't agree to do that, or this is different from my recollection. But then it gets it out into the open, rather than coming back to the next meeting and realize you all thought something different. And one example of a statement of shared values that we've already talked about once this morning is the Code of Conduct. This is a really explicit statement of our values as organizers and beliefs about this event. And what happens is, if you're somebody who's thinking of coming to the conference, you can read this and you can see what our values are. And if you think this sounds like a friendly conference, as all of you fine people clearly do, then you might come to this conference. You might think this is going to be a good place for me to come to. And if you read this and it doesn't align with your worldview, it doesn't feel like an event where you'd be safe, you don't think you'd trust yourself to be okay there, you don't come. But by making that explicit and getting it out of the way early, we save ourselves the hassle of having to deal with somebody who turns up who wasn't expecting it. And just to give a slightly more explicit example, this is a snippet from it. PyCon UK will not tolerate harassment. If you are somebody who shares our value of not being harassed at conferences, you can read this and know this is an environment where we don't want that to happen either. And so hopefully that gives you some trust in us that were that to happen, we would take steps to enforce it. And indeed, if you go and read the Code of Conduct, it does outline steps of how we would enforce these shared values. So it's not just lip service, we actually follow through on them. So those are some examples of how you might build external systems, external tools, new processes to build trust. And I'm sure you can all think of other ways you might do that in your own life, in your own work, in your own systems. So that's all great. We're starting from zero, we've built some trust. Then how do you rebuild trust? So what about when it all goes wrong? Because if you build that system, honesty, reliability, shared values, that's all great, but it's often very fragile. And it's easy to make a mistake, it all goes wrong, and suddenly you've got that loss of trust. And I'm sure we can all imagine a time where we thought we trusted somebody, and then it turns out we didn't. And that's a real gut punch. Because while trust is built in small moments, it's built incrementally over a series of interactions, it's really easy to do one thing, make one mistake, and trust evaporates instantly. Anybody think of an instant like that? I've seen quite a few nodding heads. So when trust is destroyed, it goes very quickly. It is important to note, though, a lot of people see this, and then they will add a third line and they will say it's gone forever, that once somebody betrays you, they've misplaced you discover your trust is misplaced, you never trust somebody again. And I don't necessarily think that's true. Take as an example VW. I'm sure many of you in this room may be familiar with the VW emissions scandal about 2 years ago. They were caught They were caught falsifying their emissions tests so that they would appear to pass the EU regulations, and then when they sent their cars out on the road, they would just be spewing filthy fumes and destroying the planet. And this came out, there was a big fine, I think several of their engineers went to prison, but it was a huge loss of trust in VW. Right? It was a loss of honesty, because they were lying about what they were doing, and it was a loss of the shared value of obeying the law and looking after the planet. But it's not like VW have now vanished off the face of the earth. People still buy Volkswagen cars, they still own them, they are still allowed to operate as a business, because there was a huge amount of trust inherent in the brand even before they did this bad thing. So when you lose trust, it is still possible to come back, to have some in reserve, if you're careful about it. Because again, when you have a loss of trust, I said earlier, to build trust, you can't just try harder. In the same way, if you want to rebuild trust or fix a mistake, you can't just try hard to be more trustworthy in future. It's important to look to actually taking explicit steps for that. So the way to do that, first of all, is find the cause. What went wrong? The first step of making any apology is knowing what you're apologizing for. Second is to articulate the issue. I've given you a framework today to identify how trust works. Again, honesty, reliability, shared values. So what was it a failure of? Was it a failure of honesty? Was it a failure of shared values? Was it an unreliable system? Maybe it was all three. But only when you know which bit component failed do you know what you've got to go and fix. And finally, come up with explicit, actionable steps to resolve it. Don't just say, we were caught faking all these emission tests, but we'll just, try harder next time, and hopefully people will believe us. They actually put in place a stringent program of, okay, we're going to do extra tests, we're going to focus more on clean energy, we're going to cancel our cars that are the most emissions polluting, that sort of thing. Come up with explicit steps for resolving a problem. Don't just trust it's going to work out. And one industry that does this really well, I think, is the aviation industry. Because flying inherently feels a bit weird. We all know how gravity works. We all know that things go down. And that's not going down. Flying should be this inherently untrustworthy thing, and yet it's one of the safest means of transport. In fact, I think it was last year or the year before, there were no deaths in commercial aviation. You could have got on any commercial plane that year, and you would have not, and you would be at no risk of dying. It's an incredibly safe industry. So how did they get there? Because it's not like planes don't occasionally break. But the reason the aviation industry, I think, is so trusted and so reliable is because they take a really strong view when there are accidents, or even near accidents, and they work through to find out where was the failure of reliability, where was the failure of trust, and how do we rebuild that. And one thing I think they do that's really nice is called the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. Some of you may be familiar with this. So if you imagine every layer of cheese is an overlapping component in your complex system, maybe it's an aircraft component, and where there's a hole in the cheese, that's where a problem can occur. And when they line up in just the right way, and there's a hole all the way through, something drops through, that's when a problem occurs. And what they will do is they will try to analyze every layer of the system, every component that could have failed, find all of the bugs, and fix them all at once. Don't just fix the last one, don't fix the surface problem, fix the reason, fix all the problems in the system. And to give one example of that, this is Tenerife Airport, which in 1977 was the site of the deadliest aviation crash in history. I'm sorry, I just said aviation is really safe, and now I'm telling you about a crash. But this was years before many of you were born, so it's obviously fine. Well, some of you. So in 1977, there were two planes. One of them was taking off. One of them was trying to land. They hit each other, head side on, and that was a very horrible crash. That was a very nasty crash. And the reason for it was that the pilot who was taking off thought he'd been given clearance to take off, and it turns out the tower thought he hadn't. So this was a failure of reliability on the pilot's part, the pilot promising not to cause air accidents, but also a failure of shared communication, of shared values and shared understanding. The pilot and the tower both thought they knew what go for takeoff meant, and it turns out they both understood completely different things. Now, it would have been easy for the industry at this point to say, what a silly pilot. They made a mistake. Now lots of people are dead. We would fire them for making that mistake, but actually they were killed in the accident, so I guess we're good? Now, not only would that be an incredibly insensitive thing to say, it would also not have solved the underlying problem, which is that there were discrepancies in radio communication. And so now, as a whole, the aviation industry uses really standard phraseology, really standard terminology, so they know exactly what it means when somebody says, cleared for takeoff. There's no room for ambiguity. And that's something, that's something I think perhaps, often we would benefit from. One other thing the aviation industry does that I think we should steal for the software industry is checklists. So when planes first set off, you had to be really clever, you had to have a really good memory, and remember you'd done all the things to make your plane fly. Have I attached the propeller? Have I put in petrol? Haven't I taken off the parking brake? Because if you forget any of those things, you will not go very far. And eventually, but as planes became more and more complex systems, it became harder and harder to remember all those things. So they created an external system, a checklist. And now you look at the checklist to tell you everything you need to do to fly a plane. Taking off, checklist. Landing, checklist. Seatbelt sign, checklist. Engine failure, checklist. And they're constantly adding new checklists for new scenarios. But it gives them a really reliable external system for dealing with this really reliable external tool for dealing with this complex system. I want to note as well that, and I think that'll be a really useful tool for us to have. I want to note as well, a lot of us in this room would like to think that we're really intelligent, and we are, and that we wouldn't forget anything, which we would, and therefore we don't need checklists. This is a common fallacy, especially people, I'll just remember everything. And another industry that has started looking at checklists is doctors, healthcare. And doctors are also really, really clever people. You wouldn't expect them to forget things, and yet every time checklists are introduced, there is a meaningful and noticeable drop in the rate of accidents and faults in surgery, and that's probably a good thing. So checklists are great. You should consider using some. So SwissG's model of accident causation, again, identifying all the layers in a fault, all the reasons why a system went wrong. And again, that's my steps for fixing a loss of trust. Identify what the issue was, articulate how it was a failure of trust, use the framework, use the trust triangle, and come up with explicit, actionable steps to resolve it, to rebuild trust. Because the funny thing is, actually, when we lose trust, if we rebuild it correctly, we can often end up with more trust than we started with. It's a well-studied phenomenon, for example, that if you go into a shop, you buy a piece of clothing, you get home, the clothing's got a hole in it, the shop has failed in its promise of consistency and its reliability, but then you go back and they replace it free of charge, so you had a problem and they resolved it, you are more likely to shop there again, even compared to somebody who didn't have a problem in the first place. Because remember again, trust is built as small interactions. They all build up incrementally, and that's what gives us the basis to trust somebody. And sometimes when a mistake happens and you fix it well, those are the other interactions that feed into somebody's impression of you, that feed into that layer of trust. So a mistake doesn't have to be the end of the world, as long as you don't let it be. So let's wrap up. What I've shown you today, we've talked today about trust. I've shown you my framework for thinking about trust and how trust is built: honesty, reliability, and shared values. Have all three of those things, encourage all three of those things, you have a system where trust can emerge. If you lose one of those things, you have a problem. And I've shown you some examples of how you can build external tools, external new processes, new systems to encourage those things. Not just to try harder to be more honest, but actually come up with systems for verifying and validating that. But if I want to take you to take one thing away from from today, the final thing I would leave you with is this. Trust is something you can actively build. It is not just a passive thing that happens. It doesn't just have to be something that occurs to you that you have no control over. You can take actions to affect the trust you have in yourself, that other people have in you, and that you have in other people. And I've shown you my framework for using that. You might find another system that works better for you, but the important thing is trust is not just something that happens to you. It is something you can do. And on that note, I think I'll finish. Thank you all very much. So So just briefly, because Daniele asked, I won't take questions now, but I am around all week, and if I don't look too busy, I will be happy to answer questions. Enjoy the rest of your day.